Thank you very much for coming. I'm really honored to here to be a part of this series, as well as to have a chance to be in such good university, one of the best in the country, with a strong Russian program. Before I start to talk about Russia in the 90s, I would like to say that it was a very turbulent times in the country. There was no doubt that it was the most free time for Russian journalism in the 20th century, as well as the first time Russia experienced such free journalism just before the collapse of another state of the Russian Empire. So it says something to us about the nature of the state when journalism is mostly free before the state collapse. And I have my personal project on the history of those years under Gorbachev and under Yeltsin. The websites I will show you at the end of the lecture. I called the Yeltsin era project a heyday of the Russian media, and I have no doubts about it. But the time was very controversial. And I feel to have it essential to look back, to look back, not for nostalgia, but to find some answers on why and when press freedom we have had before lost its independence. Let me start with a question to the audience. Does anyone know how many defense ministers we had in Russia since Putin came to power? Игорь Родионов, Сергей Иванов, Анатолий Сердюков, the most decorated one, Sergei Shoigu, who is the defense minister now. Well, how many prime ministers? 6 if we do not count Putin himself, who was prime minister in the very beginning, and during the term of Medvedev as president. So it was Lukashenko, Viktor Christenko, Mikhail Fratkov, Viktor Zubkov, Dmitry Medvedev, and Mikhail Mishustin. 6 prime ministers in 22 years. There are 2 guys whom you probably also know, the leaders of FSB. There are 2 of them. You know that the Russian constitution was changed recently, several years ago in 2020. And it was the second constitution under which Putin was president. I have another question. What do you think is what or who is more stable than defense ministers, FSB directors, prime ministers of the Russian Federation? Konstantin Neres. He was appointed a General 1 director in October of 1999. Oleg Dobrodeyev, ВГТРК chairman since January of 2000. It says something to us about the state of the media and the regime, right? Here they are. With decorations, with personal meetings with president. They were the leaders of the biggest TV companies in Russia for more than 20 years. It was no any circumstances that allowed them to raise their voice for journalists being threatened, beaten, murdered, or for those who escaped. It was not Oleg Dobrodeyev's voice, even recently, several days ago, when his old friend's son, Vladimir Karamurza, the younger, was convicted in high treason and who was sent to prison for 25 years. Of course, no one expected that that Dobrodeev would say something against Vladimir Putin and his rule, since Dobrodeev and Karamurza, the older, were not friends anymore since the collapse of NTV. They understood differently what is authoritarianism in Russia and what role media should play in it. Dobrodeev serves the regime, Karamurza could not. And he lost his job in the very beginning of the Putin's term. Vladimir Karamurza, the younger, the junior, also could not serve the regime. That's why he's sentenced now to prison. He smiles listening to the judge, Sergei Prigorov. I agree with the Washington Post editorial in which the staff wrote a column saying that Karamurza should be free. Mr. Karamurza should be designated by the United States as unlawfully or wrongfully detained, the editorial states. It will facilitate negotiating prisoner exchange with Russia. Mr. Karamurza is a permanent resident of the United States, and his wife, Evgenia Karamurza, and 3 children, U.S. citizens. He clearly meets the requirements for such designation, which Ms. Karamurza has been seeking. American journalists were frightened and terrified by another arrest in Moscow, which was done recently. Evan Gershkovich from the Wall Street Journal was arrested under the charges of spying charges. But I believe that for the Russians, it was not such a shocking event. As Joshua Yaffa, a long-time correspondent for the New Yorker from Russia, wrote in his column, it was hard to explain to our friends and family back home, to our editors, even to ourselves. It was a degree to which we, as foreign correspondents, continued to occupy a position of relative privilege and safety. The bosses and owners of our media organizations were in New York. They could readily be pressured or blackmailed. Putin can close down the Wall Street Journal or the New York, but on a more basic level, we went towards the trouble. Our audiences were far away, and nothing published in English was going to threaten Putin's hold on power or the stability of the political system. And the Kremlin long ago gave up caring about its image in the West. So the situation has changed. It was not just Gershkovich who had troubles in Moscow being a foreign correspondent. David Sutter, a famous American scholar, Russian media scholar, and a correspondent who came first into the Soviet Union in 1976, was the first journalist, first American journalist since the Cold War who was not allowed to come to Moscow. Paul Khlebnikov, an American journalist with the Russian descent, was murdered, and of course it was an assassination, and we still don't know why it happened and who was in charge. He was murdered in 2004. Anna Politkovskaya also had an American citizenship, and it became known after her assassination on Vladimir Putin's birthday in 2006, on October 7th. But the situation with Yerkovich, according to the best lawyer for protection of press freedom in Russia, on my personal opinion, Ivan Pavlov signals that he says it was a signal sent to the foreign journalists. It means such an unspoken rule of not taking a hostage out of foreign journalists does not function anymore. Any foreign or Russian journalist who honestly and professionally does his or others' job can be accused of spying or high treason. Ivan Pavlov stands here with Ivan Safronov, another Russian journalist who was convicted in spying also in 2020. He was a brilliant journalist who worked for Kommersant and wrote articles about Ministry of Defense and its contracts. The majority of the Russian press and its leaders believe that Safronov was, as in the case with Karamurza, was accused of false convictions, and it was just a political revenge for his job, for what he has done, what he had done before being a journalist. Russian journalism became one of the first casualties of the full-scale war launched in Ukraine in 2022. As well as other political activities in Russia, it has been criminalized. You cannot call this war a war. Other ways, you will be sent to prison, as it happened with Ilya Yashin, another prominent political oppositional leader who is now in prison. The same happened to Alexei Gorinov, a Moscow deputy who told not even in the public meeting, in their office at the Moscow deputies meeting, that they should not have some joyful activities since the war started. But the atmosphere in Russia became very hard to the Russian journalists a long time before the launch of the war. According to one estimate, in 2021 alone, just before the war started, there were about 1,500 journalists and activists who left Russia. As Agence Media reported, within 2 weeks of the launch of the war, the invasion in Ukraine, at least 150 journalists left, all 17 Russian language media outlets. By the end of this year of 2022, there were at least 500 journalists who had to leave the country. By some estimates, about 30 media outlets are now working from abroad for the public, for the Russian audience, speaking about war and criminal activities of the regime, but they cannot do it in their country. Another prominent lawyer, Ilya Novikov, who also did a lot to support press freedom in Russia, calls it NFL journalism. Everything that is not propaganda is being eliminated. That's what Dmitry Muratov, Nobel Peace Prize winner, told to the New York Times. Of course, you all know that Muratov was an editor-in-chief of Novaya Gazeta, which had to be stopped. It does not operate in Russia anymore. On the next slide, you can see just some of the media outlets which were closed in Russia. You see that all the foreign media with excellent journalists, including Russian nationals, from BBC, Radio Liberty, Voice of America, and Deutsche Welle, had to leave the country. but there are many more. Roskomnadzor is a state agency that blocks the websites on the internet, has a registry, and I believe there are more than millions of the addresses of different media outlets, different websites, which are trying to rebuild themselves using the new address, but they are blocked. Russians feel eager to learn what is going on. I believe Alexander can tell you later about the numbers the Moscow Times got gained during this time. And it's almost the same for every single Russian independent media outlet whose audiences grew a lot. It was another media outlet called Kulturu, which was a liberal one, but a cultural one. They almost didn't touch politics, but they closed themselves and stated, the freedom of expression is reduced to zero, and we think it is honest to go silent under those circumstances. They were not alone in such position. Several media outlets closed themselves, thinking that there are no possibilities to work in the country. Even Condé Nast, with its 7 glossy magazines, announced that it would close its entire Russian franchise. So what's left? In the Soviet movie called Moscow Does Not Believe Tears, an Oscar winner and a Russian very famous movie, there is one hero who famously says, there will be nothing but television in the future. У нас будет одно сплошное телевидение. Here we are. This tower in Moscow, I believe, is the base of the regime and its servant is an Ostankino tower. Was it always like this in the country? Despite all the freedoms the journalists had in the 90s, Yeltsin started with the parliament. Then Putin, it depends on the position some has. Anyway, constitutional crisis of 1993 ended up in October with Yeltsin, who shelved the Russian parliament. A number of scholars call it a turning point towards autocracy. However, by the end of this year, a new constitution was adopted, and it was immediately called super presidential. The constitution stated that Russian media should be free, and it should be no censorship. Actually, it was the repetition of the same article in the media law, in the media law, but of course it was very important that the main law in the country also states this. I would leave the space to the lawyers to decide how much it was checked and balanced, but I would like to tell that President had a lot of power over the media. He could establish them. Here we see that to decrease creation the TV company Moskva, which later became TV Center, or the creation of Peterburg TV channel, which is so-called Fifth Channel under Yuri Kovalchuk now. And we see the leaders of NTV which was also given its frequency by 2 decrees in 1993 and in 1996. And you see Oleg Dobrodeyev just in the middle between Evgeny Kiselov and President Yeltsin. One of those who was an independent journalist 20 years ago, 30 years ago, sorry, fighting for press freedom. So it was the independent channel, which was owned by a mogul, by a private businessman, famously known Vladimir Putin, who, by the way, had not talked any word since then, since the seizure of NTV in 2001. He remains silent, not expressing any opinions. So it was a private company, but it got a frequency by presidential decree. For 1993, there were several hours NTV had on the fourth channel. After the elections of Yeltsin in 1996, election gave a whole time, all 24 hours to the channel. Still, NTV was considered independent because of its position during the First Chechen War, which was launched on the end of December in 1994, and it lasted until the summer of 1996. But on the matter of Yeltsin's support when he was vulnerable, NTV was on his side. They were on his side after the parliament crisis in 1993. They started to broadcast just a week after the crisis, but of course they were against the parliament with which Yeltsin fought. And they were famously on the side of Yeltsin in 1996 electoral campaign. So when NTV started to oppose Kremlin in 1999, Kremlin reminded who was there in charge and how independent Kremlin considers NTV. The takeover of the channel took 2 years. It started in 1999 in the summer and ended up with a takeover of a new management, and the general director of a new company was an American citizen with a Russian background, with the Russian family roots, Boris Yordan. Some people naively believed that he would be a symbol of independent TV channel who could protect it, since he knew from his very beginning of the life the First Amendment of the American Constitution. But he was not. He was easily moved 1 year later when NTV covered the catastrophe, the terrorist act in the Moscow's theater. President himself and his administration disliked the coverage and they fired Yordan. Anyway, by the beginning of 2002, Kremlin gained control over 2 national TV channels, NTV, which belonged to Pusinsky, and ORT, which belonged to Berezovsky. They were not the best supporters of the free press. They had their own agenda. They used press a lot. And actually, it is one of the reasons why the Russians lost the trust to the independent press. One of my first staff jobs was Независимая газета. I came there after Сегодня newspaper was closed. which belonged to the same holding that Usinsky owned. And actually, it was breaking point for my future. I started to write about television, having a lot of wonders about how it should be done ideally in an ideal world. Writing about press freedom and news about the media life. So I was a witness for about 15 years who also covered the media life in Russia, how Putin gained control over the media. It was done step by step. And even when journalists and their audiences were not silent, he could do it. He could gain such a control, which allows now to send to prison people who like something on Facebook, who repost something, or who express their opinion on what's going on in the country. So it started with the level of 2 national TV channels and ended up as a nightmare when anybody can be sent to prison. But I started to talk about the TV companies which were opened, which were launched by presidential decrees. And the web was not alone. Here are just several TV channels which was created by President himself. Privatization of the ORT channel, which was done in 1995, also used presidential power. It was also done presidential decree. When ORT had economic issues after the crisis of 1998, economic crisis in Asia, which influenced Russia, President Yeltsin provided financial support to ORT, and it was Внешэкономбанк, whom President obliged by decree to pay $100 million to ORT to recover. The whole TV advertisement market at this time was 180,000 millions. So it was just a little bit less than twice. You would not believe probably, but even Radio Liberty, an American broadcaster, was regulated by a president. When Yeltsin won in August of 1991, when he had possibility to become new president of Russia after the coup d'etat, he immediately wrote a decree on Radio Liberty. Just 2 years after his power as president, Putin also signed a decree. And since then, Radio Liberty had a lot of issues in Moscow. It lost frequencies, it lost audiences, it lost its partners in the regions because of intimidation of FSB, who advised those entities, business entities, not to cooperate with American broadcaster. Now, as many other foreign media outlets, Radio Liberty had to evacuate a whole team of journalists from Moscow. That's another power of president. He had the power to appoint leaders of some media companies, such was Igor Yakovlev, a famously known editor-in-chief of Moskovsky Novosti, who brought attention of a whole nation to the newspaper. After he served his term as the editor of the newspaper, he was appointed a leader of the first channel. It was called Ostankino back then. He served for about 1 year. He was a good figure, some sort of compromise between Yeltsin and Gorbachev. But when Yeltsin did not like the coverage of conflict in the Caucasus between Severny Ossetia and Ingush Republic. He fired and even explained that he was fired for this coverage. It was a huge scandal in Moscow. Yakovlev had a reputation, a world reputation, but it did not help. Yeltsin rewrote this decree. In a new decree, he did not mention the reason for the dismissal of Yakovlev. He just said that, so he found a new job, that's why he's leaving his position. Here we see another presidential power to give awards to the journalists, to the leaders of the media companies. On the first photo, Yeltsin is standing in front of VGTRK journalists, which celebrated 5 years of work. It was launched by Yeltsin, who actually fought with Mikhail Gorbachev, fighting for so-called Russian system of the media. You probably know that unlike other republics of the Soviet Union, Russian Federation, which U.S.S.R, which was a part of it, had no its own media. So media which were having offices in Moscow and which broadcasted from Moscow served the Soviet Union as the capital of the Soviet Union. But Yeltsin fought with the parliament to have its own Russian presidential system of the media, and it was launched. It was a VGTRK channel, RTR channel, RTV back then, which became Russia now. It was a magazine called Rodina, Motherland. It was Radio Россия, and it was Российская газета. So when Yeltsin came to power, not just as president of SFSR, but became a newly elected president of the Russian Federation, he, by his own means, had power over RTR or RTV. Here you see his supporter, Oleg Paptsov, getting an award from Yeltsin, who was a chief of RTR. And he got liberal press. The mainstream was liberal, and it was presidential mainstream. But also as president, he, of course, was in charge of Ostankino, the first channel. So from the very beginning of the state, president had a lot of power over television, and Putin just continued this tradition. Now we can see several other awardees, people who got awards from Putin. The mostly famous propagandists Margarita Simonyan and Vladimir Solovyov, who became warmongers, and Ignatenko, the leader of the TASS agency for a couple of decades. I would like to talk about the liberalization of prices, which started in January of 1992 and was a nightmare for independent press, especially for print. Print lost its readership. Costs grew a lot. Subscription prices, I mean. As one of the media scholars, Georgy Vachnadze, wrote, newspaper became a luxury. People could not afford even one newspaper to have in subscription, losing all their money during those turbulent years. And actually, the press never recovered. By 1992, print lost at least 18 million readers. Argumenty Fakty had a circulation of 33 million copies in 1990. And it was this record was fixed in the Guinness Book of Records. By 1992, its readership decreased by the number of magnitude. By the end of the Yeltsin era, the federal newspaper Izvestia had a little more than 130,000 copies in a country with more than 140 million people. Before, they had 3,200,000 copies before the January of 1990. Kommersant had a little more than 1,000 copies during Yeltsin times and the beginning of Putin era. So-called influential papers in Moscow had something about 30,000 copies. I worked for such paper, it was Сегодня. Journalists were very proud that they are very influential because their paper was in Kremlin and read by very important people. But the mass audience left with television. So now we see the result, a terrible result of those times. Here, the slide which expresses a lot. It says that poor press cannot be independent. That's why the journalists wait for the state support. That's how journalists understood journalism in the beginning of the 90s. Of course, they could not have the support from oligarchs. They were not born in the very beginning of the 90s, not yet. So Izvestia has such an article begging for the financial support from the state, from the donations or subsidies. And actually, a lot of journalists had it. So state became the main actor on the Russian media market. From the very beginning, press had no money and went to the state. At the end of the 90s, press lost its independence belonging to the oligarchs. So when this press ministry was found, it had a power to close the newspapers, having two precautions. And it was quite a threat to the media. Here is Mikhail Lesin, one of the famous ministers who was the most brutal and helped Putin to take over NTV and TRT. And now we see the successor, Roskomnadzor, which has those unimaginable lists with a number of media outlets which are not allowed now in Russia. I have several slides about reasons why we failed as Russian journalists. They were not only authoritarian rule which is to blame. Journalists themselves had a lack of understanding of the profession. Journalists were activists or members of parliament, very famous members. They were deputies, they were messiahs who knew better, who knew for the people, who lacked professional standards. They did not follow ethical rules. Ethic codes were created by the Union of Soviet Journalists, for example, which was not influential in the Soviet Union and was not, and the next organization, which was called Union of Russian Journalists, was not influential as well. So technically, an ethic code existed, but no one followed it. Journalists took sides during the main political events like 1993, 1996, 1999. And when I started to work for Независимая газета, which means independent newspaper, some of my friends, not journalists, laughed at me, asking, from whom this newspaper is independent? Is it independent from Boris Berezovsky, the owner? When those famous guys, Boris Berezovsky on the right, Vladimir Businsky on the left, and in the middle is Igor Maloshenko, who committed suicide several years ago. He was one of the main persons on NTV channel who became a part of the presidential campaign in 1986. He did not leave the position of NTV president, so it was an obvious conflict of interests. But he famously told, and to me as well, when I interviewed him for several times, that no one would believe. This is not America, Natasha, he said. No one would believe if I leave, I would leave this position and become a campaigner for Yeltsin and then come back. No one would believe that I'm independent or NTV is not dependent on me. It was one of those mistakes for which we pay a high price now. When Alexander and his colleagues launched a newspaper, Ведомости, together with the Wall Street Journal and Financial Times in September of 1999, it was a famous slogan that any oligarch can buy our paper, in a kiosk, This paper was a brilliant financial paper, and it was quite a unique situation when global competitors such as the Wall Street Journal and Financial Times produced something together. It never happened before and never happened after. It was like Pepsi-Cola and Coca-Cola would unite in Russia to produce kvass. But this kvass was quite good. In 2014, right? The newspaper was sold in 2014.
Yes, because of the law, yes.
Which
was introduced against us.
Which did not allow foreign institutions and foreign persons, foreign nationalities to own the paper more than 25%. So that's what was done to suppress Ведомости, and those Western brands immediately left the paper. It was done for Forbes, which was also had to be sold. So the foreign ownership was for some time, for about 10 years, a guarantor of free speech for their journalists. But Putin did everything he could to destroy press. I was hoping that some of the policy makers could be here in the audience or listen to me online. So I wanted to tell that we all do not know how and when it all ends. But I know for sure that without the press, nothing can be done. Nothing can be changed in the country. The press reporting truthfully and analyzing knowledgeably is a must the country should have to be changed. Russian journalists were not really heard by the Western partners, their colleagues, for more than 20 years. But now Putin became a threat not only for the Russian journalists. He became a threat for the whole world, including Gershkovich in Moscow and any other journalists who is still there. There are not a lot, though, but there are still some brave journalists, Russian citizens and foreign citizens who still cover what's going on in Russia. Those who reported in Moscow been under constant threat for more than 20 years. They were under searches, arrests, intimidation, liability, all sorts of other threats for doing their jobs. Those who are still reporting were being designated foreign agents, undesirable organizations, which actually on a new level means the same what happened to the country in the 1930s. They are the enemies of the state. Those who left their home country but still report are still under the threat of Kremlin, but Kremlin could not silence them. I believe that those journalists should have support. And it's not only their future, it's not only their career to have, it's the future of the whole world, of safety of the world. We saw how easily, just in 20 years, a country can become totalitarian. A country can launch wars, and it's not the first war, as you all excellently know. Putin was not stopped when he managed to gain control over NTB, over ORT, when he was in charge of assassination of journalists, I personally believe, but have no proof, and I don't know when and how we could learn this lesson. He was not stopped when he launched war against Georgia, against Ukraine, when he annexed Crimea. He was not stopped yet, but he must be stopped. When he will be stopped, it should be a place for the Russians who remain in the country, who will not leave the country, who will stay there forever. They should have free press. They should understand what is going on. And it is a matter of the political institutions and funds on the West, I believe, to support them. No one else can support them now. Even YouTube, it's not a political institution, but if it will be closed, a lot of millions of the Russian audience will lose their last free voice, even from abroad. Thank you very much for coming. I hope something will change in the nearest future.